All right, hello everyone again. I'm here to introduce Lydia X.Z. Brown, who will be our next speaker. Lydia Brown is a disability justice advocate, organizer, educator, attorney, strategist, and writer whose work has largely focused on violence against multiply marginalized disabled people, especially with respect to institutionalization, incarceration, and policing. They have worked to advance transformative change through organizing in the streets, writing legislation, conducting anti-ableism workshops, testifying at regulatory and policy hearings, and disrupting institutional complacency everywhere, from the academy to state agencies and the nonprofit industrial complex. Brown co-leads the Project on Disability Rights and Algorithmic Fairness at the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy at Georgetown University Law Center, teaches for Georgetown University's Disability Studies program through the Department of English, and supports the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network's public policy advocacy. Additionally, Brown founded and directs the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependence, Survival, and Empowerment, which provides direct support, mutual aid, and community reparations to autistic people of color. Brown is also co-editor and visionary behind All the Weight of Our Dreams, the first ever anthology of writings and artwork by autistic people of color and otherwise negatively racialized autistic people, published by AWN. Brown graduated from Northeastern University School of Law as a public interest law scholar, and we are very lucky to have you. Please begin when you're ready.
It's great to be able to join you. Before we begin, I like to ask everybody who is present to take a few moments of grounding. I'm going to share a couple of slides with you during our time, and the first slide that I want to share with you shows silhouettes of people who have different body shapes and sizes. They are moving, lying, or sitting in many different configurations. Some have mobility equipment, one has a service dog, one is pushing a baby stroller. My favorite one is the person who is lying horizontally flat on the ground, because that person actively speaks to all of my feelings and emotions, especially during COVID-19. That person embodies me. My invitation is for you to use the space that you are in as comfortably as possible for your body-mind. I would like for you to think about what it is you've carried or brought with you into this space. Whether you've brought into this space your grief, your mourning, your rage, your frustration, your confusion, your anxiety. Whether you have brought into this space joy or excitement, satisfaction, appreciation. Whether you are in this space now and you are experiencing hunger or thirst. And by the way, now is a great time to go grab something to drink or go get something to eat. Please go do that. You can eat. You're not on video. Nobody can see you. It's fine. And even if we could see you, it would still be fine. Do you need to move around? Do you need to change where you are sitting? Do you need to occupy a different part of the room? Do you need to move outside or inside? Find somewhere comfortable to be instead of a chair if that would be better for you, or stay in the chair if you prefer that. Let's take a moment just to imagine and make for ourselves in our space what it would feel like for our body minds to be present, to be comfortable, to be cared for. Thank you for doing that with me. I begin every presentation and facilitation the same way, and that invitation is at its core a small practice of disability justice. It is a practice that is common in spaces that center disabled people's experiences, in neurodiversity affirming spaces, in self-advocacy spaces, all of which are spaces where those of us who have always been told that the ways our body minds move and communicate are wrong, are claiming space for ourselves, are reminding ourselves and others that our body minds, that who we are, deserve to exist, that we deserve to take up space, that we should not have to force ourselves to comply with ableist, white supremacist, and gendered expectations of what body minds are supposed to look like, how body minds are supposed to move, how body minds are supposed to communicate, but rather that we deserve to exist and to be as we are. Disability justice asks us to honor the body minds of all people, our own and those of the people who we work alongside, who we live alongside, those who are in our communities, those with whom we advocate. But it also asks us to make space for and honor our own body minds. So thank you for engaging in that with me. The next note that I want to make sure that you have is a content note for the discussion for the next 40 minutes or so. I will be talking about some issues of abuse and violence. I will be including a few graphic details at part of this presentation without pictures, just some description. If at any time you feel the need to take a break, you are welcome to do that. If you find that you no longer have the capacity to participate or engage, then you are welcome to withdraw from this time as well. The image that is on this slide shows a person in a silhouette with a ponytail yelling into a bullhorn directly at the words for the content warning. I want you all to know this because it's very common, especially in professional and legal spaces, for us to make the assumption that the people who are present are not personally impacted by the topics that we discuss, or that if we are, it's by a degree of separation. It is that the people who are here represent people who are directly affected, or the people who are here provide services to the people who are directly affected, but often not recognizing that we are, in fact, often those who are directly impacted. That for many of us who are present now, we are in fact living re-traumatization of ableism, of settler colonialism, of white supremacy every day. And so I do not like to pretend or to hold on to an illusion that those who are present during my talks are not direct survivors of or witnesses to the violence that we will speak of. So I give this note to you so that it is not a surprise to you or a shock when later I will be speaking about some topics of violence, so that you have the ability to decide for yourself what you can hold and what you can engage with today, and where you will need to take a break for your own participation. I'm going to spend today talking about the impact and the relevance of disability justice and neurodiversity in law, and what that means for me as an autistic person, but also more broadly, what that means for all of us who are disabled, who must interact with the law and with criminal and civil legal systems, and must live in a profoundly violent and destructive society. The image that is on this screen shows a diagram that was frequently used during the Eugenics era of the late 18th and early 19th century, 19th and 20th. I went to law school because I can't do math. Don't ever look at me for that. The late 19th, early 20th century, correction. The image shows a staircase, and on that staircase, there are different quote unquote levels, and they range from the bottom, from the labels of idiot, through low, medium, and high-grade imbecile to the top, which is labeled moron. And the drawings are meant to depict caricatures of the stereotypical appearance of people who have mental disabilities of one or another kind. They are labeled according to gradations of the type of work that each is thought to be able to perform, ranging from mere self-preservation through menial, manual, and complex manual work to work requiring reason and judgment. The title of this diagram, Steps in Mental Development, subtitled Where They Stumble, the Limit of Development of Each Type, helps to illustrate what this diagram was meant to show, which is a very crass and explicit representation of the eugenics ideal, of determining which types of humans were thought to be worth reproducing and being reproduced, and which types of humans instead were not thought to be worth reproducing or being reproduced. The eugenics movement underlies much of the work that we do today as advocates, because it drives our educational system, our healthcare system, and our criminal legal system. Eugenics, long thought to be an outdated and archaic set of beliefs that we more closely associate with and attribute to the Third Reich, the Nazi era in Germany, actually had its roots and its heyday in the United States. Adolf Hitler was inspired by the United States, and particularly was inspired by how the United States enacted white supremacy by systematically and structurally subordinating Black enslaved people and Native communities and populations subject to genocide, and through mass institutionalization of disabled people. The images on this screen show two propaganda posters from Nazi-era Germany. The one on the left-hand side is a poster that depicts in dark shades a person intended to represent the stereotype of somebody with a mental disability, and it is labeled that the cost of supporting this person is 5.5 marks, but for the same cost, in contrast, on the other side of the poster, a family depicted in light-colored shades that shows people that are supposed to be depicted as abled, strong, and neurotypical is labeled for that same cost. This whole family could be supported instead. And on the right-hand side, the other poster is a propaganda poster showing an orphanage with beds that are very large, long, and quite uncomfortable looking, and two orderlies in jackets. And the text on it says life only as a burden in German. It's the translation. The eugenics era was occupied deeply with questions of which kinds of people would be stronger, which kinds of people would be more intelligent, and therefore which kinds of people would instead be drains or burdens upon society, which kinds of people should not be suffered to exist. But the reality is that eugenics has never disappeared. It remains deeply embedded in all facets of the United States, in our entire jurisprudential history, and in our entire civil system, and in our entire criminal system. It is embedded and pervasive in our educational system, from K to 12 education and in higher education as well. It is deeply embedded into our healthcare systems, healthcare delivery, healthcare services, sites of healthcare services, and the way in which we conceptualize who is deserving of access to healthcare and who, in turn, is not. All of this comes down to understanding the ways in which our society defines certain types of people's body minds as valuable, worthy, and desirable, and other people's body minds as not valuable, not worthy, and not desirable. That is, defining some people's body minds as unpersons under the law, as deserving of subjugation, of subordination, and of suppression. In disability, we talk about this often through the lens of ableism. The word ableism refers to a system of structural oppression, that is, a system of power relations in society, by which the people whose bodies and brains are considered normal, strong, sane, healthy, whole, intelligent, stable, are considered to be not only normal people, but ideal people, valuable people, truly human. And in contrast, people who are instead considered to be sick, disordered, deficient, broken, delinquent, or dependent are then rendered as undeserving of existence, of living, of breathing, of taking up space, of having any place in society or in families. Ableism is inherently racist. In this country, it is important and necessary to name that ableism is inherently and specifically anti-Black in nature. It is also anti-Indigenous in nature. Why? Because ableism underlies, is embedded into, and is necessary for white supremacy. The logic of white supremacy, that whiteness is ideal and superior, depends upon the notion of racialized people's bodies and minds as inferior, or to the extent to which we have any perhaps desirable physical characteristics, that those characteristics only exist to emphasize our closer similarity to non-human animals than to that of white humans, and therefore also to be used only for extraction and exploitation. That is, that white supremacy is a deeply ableist set of logics about which bodies and minds are valuable and superior, and which bodies and minds are not valuable and inferior. Ableism is also an inherently capitalist system, which is, ableism is deeply concerned with valuing us based on what we produce, based on how quickly we produce it, what it is we are producing, how much of it we are producing, and to whose benefit and to whose detriment we are producing it. Ableism is concerned with our contribution to capital, with our contribution to wealth accumulation, with our ability and capacity to be exploited. And this underlies even the quote-unquote disability rights rhetoric that disabled people should be respected in society and have access to rights because we can work too. That is, predicating our ability to receive respect or some access to legal recognition based on our ability to perform labor in a way that is recognized and understood within a capitalist system. And ableism is, of course, deeply and profoundly eugenicist because it depends on the ability of those in power to decide who should be allowed to reproduce, what kinds of people should be allowed to be reproduced. But ableism is so much more than a set of ideas. It appears and shows up in every part of our lives. The image that is on this screen shows in the middle a circle that says oppression, and ringing that circle in smaller circles are the words prejudice, bias, bigotry, hate, and power to indicate some of the manifestations of ableism and some of the ways that ableism shows up. Ableism is oppression. That means that it is a system of power differentials. It is a relationship wherein the people who are considered to be healthy, sane, and typical have power economically, socially, and politically at the direct expense of people who are considered to be not smart, not strong, not healthy, not able. Ableism shows up in every part of our society. Let's talk about some of those ways. In 1932, you know what? Whatever year this was, it was the 1930s. Don't do numbers. I'm not going to be able to do numbers today. In the 1930s, we passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set out much of our modern labor law framework today. And part of the Fair Labor Standards Act is a section called Section 14C, which allows for the payment of sub-minimum wage to disabled people. That is, payment of as little as cents per hour for often very menial work performed by disabled people under a commensurate wage theory. That is, the belief that if disabled people take longer to do less work, that disabled people should be paid a wage commensurate with the ability of their work output. And that provision remains legal today, so that there are only a few classifications of people in the United States who can be legally paid less than the minimum wage, which is a concept, of course, that makes no goddamn sense, because if there is a minimum wage, then that means that it's supposed to be a floor rather than a kind of floor that you built 2 feet above the actual floor, and also there's another sub-basin beneath that and 3 more sub-basins beneath that. Minimum means minimum, but in US law, you can be paid less than minimum wage if you have been incarcerated for a crime. You can be paid nothing. You can be actually enslaved. That is the language of the 13th Amendment. Slavery shall not exist but for a punishment for crime. If you are undocumented, then under the law, you are not entitled to be able to be paid anything. So people who employ you, if you are undocumented, can get away with the worst and most obvious forms of wage theft because you are not entitled to any protections under law. If you belong to certain classifications of rural agricultural workers, provisions that predominantly affect Black and brown workers in rural areas, then you can also be paid less than minimum wage. And if you work in a tipped profession, then you can be paid minimum wage if your tips make up the difference, which of course opens the door for employers to engage in routine wage theft, even though it is technically against the law to do so. And if you are a disabled person outside of a prison, even with papers, you can also be paid less than minimum wage. Section 14C helps to illustrate how under capitalism, there are certain classifications of human beings who are literally devalued under law in the United States. In 1927, that year I do know is correct, so points for remembering a number. The Supreme Court decided in a decision called Buck v. Bell that it was not only not a violation of constitutional rights, but in fact in the public interest to engage in eugenic forced sterilization. The case revolved around a white woman, Carrie Buck, who had been labeled with intellectual disabilities. Her mother was also labeled with intellectual disabilities, and her infant child, who had been a product of sexual assault, was also labeled with intellectual disabilities. Carrie was forcibly sterilized, and her case brought to the Supreme Court by proponents of eugenics as a test case, a term that we usually associate with progressive and civil rights law organizations attempting to establish positive precedent for other litigators and advocates to follow and use in their own work. The test case in Buck v. Bell established that the state has an interest in controlling and regulating reproductive capacity. And so that decision, 1927, has never been overturned. It was in fact used as supportive precedent in the Roe v. Wade decision establishing a right to abortion care. And after Buck v. Bell between 1927 and 1979, the United States documented more than 70,000 sterilizations. Those sterilizations were largely carried out upon the basis of sexual deviance, of criminality, and of mental defectiveness or feeble-mindedness. These three categories were meant to elide clear boundaries, to blur together, because they essentially meant the same thing. Who were the socially undesirable people that shouldn't be reproducing, and how do we prevent them from reproducing? In referring to Carrie, her mother, and her child, the acting justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in that case, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. You'll remember that the word imbecile appeared on the diagram in the earlier slide. The word imbecile was once a diagnostic category, as were the terms idiot, moron, and mental retardate. These terms were used to classify whole ranges of people with disabilities, including many autistic people who would not have been labeled as autistic at the time because the word was not widely used in diagnostic terminology until at least the middle of the 20th century. Those are only the sterilizations that we know about. As recently as 2013, advocates in California documented continuing sterilizations in California prisons, largely targeting Chicana women who were incarcerated there. Over the history of the United States' existence, we have used eugenic sterilization primarily to target Black, Native, Chicanx, and Latinx people who have been labeled with those varying and blurred categories of sexually deviant, criminal, and mentally defective, because these terms are deeply and closely connected and interlinked in the popular imagination and in the power structures that underlie the laws that we grapple with today. In the United States, we are also the proud home to the only institution in the entire country known to publicly use electric shock as punishment on disabled people. This institution is called the Judge Rotenberg Center, and it is located south of Boston in Massachusetts. The Judge Rotenberg Center uses this form of quote-unquote therapy as a way of enacting behavioral modification on the largely autistic, 90% Black and Latinx people that are confined there. This, to be clear and to be very specific, it's not the same thing as electroconvulsive therapy or electrostatic treatment, both of which are commonly talked about, especially in the psychiatric survivors context, as forms of treatment that have also been used very abusively and very coercively, and that also have very damaging side effects when used, especially without fair warning and without meaningful consent for the people that are accessing them. What the Judge Rotenberg Center uses is instead a backpack that has wires coming out of it with electrodes at the end that are taped to the arms, legs, and torso of the person receiving the shocks. When that person engages in a behavior, which can be defined in a person's behavior plan as anything from actual acts of physical violence to getting out of seat without permission, uttering a swear word, or closing their eyes while walking in the hallway, then a staff person will press a button on a remote control that emits a shock from a device that was deliberately designed to be more painful and powerful than a police taser. This has been condemned twice by the United Nations in human rights reports where the US was singled out by name specifically because of this facility, and yet it remains legal. And not only is it legal, but a judge in probate and family court signs off on an order every single time the use of the electric shock punishment is approved for a person's behavior plan. This is despite decades of advocacy to close down the place, which has now been operating for nearly half a century, during which time 6 people have died. Ableism is the reality that people with developmental disabilities who are labeled as women, which might include people who are not actually women, but this is the way the statistics are gathered, face sexual assault at rates between 83% to 96%, depending on which statistic you are looking at. That is 83 to 96% of people with developmental disabilities labeled as women have been sexually assaulted at least once. More than half that number have been sexually assaulted at least 10 times by the age of 18 alone, which does not include what happens after the age of 18. Of those with developmental disabilities who are labeled as men, the statistic that is available is about 40% have been sexually assaulted at least once. It is highly likely that not only are all of these numbers severe underestimates, but they still do not disaggregate to account for differences for race, for gender, for socioeconomic class, for LGBTQ identity, and for religion, and for culture. Those numbers are only an average across the board that is already itself likely an underestimate. And we also know that in the education system, that students with disabilities, especially developmental and psychiatric disabilities, are significantly more likely to be subjected to suspension, expulsion, restraint, and seclusion if they are also Black or brown, leaving Black or brown disabled students as the most likely demographic to face criminalization and school pushout. In our criminal legal system, the organization HEARD, helping educate to advance the rights of the deaf, has estimated that upwards of 80% of all people who are killed by police are disabled, and that similarly, perhaps as many as or more than 80% of all people who are incarcerated are disabled, and that as many as 100% of all people who are incarcerated and sentenced to capital punishment on death row are disabled. But let's go back to our specific conversation today. You spent the day thinking about autism and autistic people in particular. Let me pull out two more statistics for you. Number one, autistic people are likely on average to die more than 30 years younger than non-autistic people. The second leading cause of our deaths is suicide. Number two, and I'm sorry, there's three statistics. I should not do numbers. Number two, as many as 65% of all people who are homeless may be autistic or have a related developmental disability. 65%. And number three, for every single subsequent level of educational attainment, autistic people's unemployment rate increases. That is, an autistic person who has a postgraduate degree is significantly less likely to be employed than an autistic person who never completed a high school diploma. And at every gradation of educational attainment between those two numbers, autistic people's ability to be employed decreases. Autistic people's likelihood of being employed decreases, because in the world we live in, ableism is so profound that it affects every single sphere of life. Access to healthcare, access to employment, access to safe and affordable housing, access to safe homes, romantic, loving relationships and families, access to school, and access to justice. But the last one I want to leave you with to illustrate the crisis of ableism that we as autistic and other disabled people contend with is the reality of filicide of disabled people. In 2012, autistic activist Zoe Gross organized for the first time a vigil for a day of mourning after the murder of George Hodgkins at age 22, whose mother shot him in the face. She shot him in the face, she claimed, because he did not have adequate access to services and she was overwhelmed as a parent taking care of her autistic adult son, and therefore she snapped she had no choice left but to kill him. This story has been echoed in thousands of other stories of disabled people who were murdered largely by their parents or by other family members and caregivers. And every year since 2012, disabled people across the country and increasingly internationally host vigils at which we honor the lives of disabled people who were killed by their family members. There is a website, disability-memorial.org, that catalogs all of the stories that we know about. Now, those are only the ones that we know about. The first years that we held the vigils in 2012 and in 2013, the list of names fit on one very large poster. And we listed the names, the ages at which people were murdered, and the manner in which people were murdered. This year in 2020, the list of known names was so long that even if only the list of names without any additional information, it took up over, I think, 10 pages in a very small font. And vigil organizers were asked, by and large, not to read the full list of names because we might be standing there for hours if we attempted to do that. Now, people often ask me, especially looking at the diagram you see in front of you with this word hate, okay, but you might be exaggerating. You might be being a little hyperbolic, Lydia. Do people really hate disabled people? Who hates disabled people? Sure, some people are ignorant, some people are condescending, some people just don't really understand, but does anyone actually hate disabled people? Well, I can tell you about Callista Springer, who was 16 years old when her family chained her to a bed, then lit the house on fire and let her die. Or I could tell you about London McCabe, whose mother drove to the middle of a bridge in Portland, Oregon, got out of the car and threw him over the bridge to drown him in the water below. Or I could tell you about Alex Sportalakis, whose godmother and great aunt together tried to forcibly overdose him on his medication to kill him. That didn't work. So instead they stabbed him to death over 20 times in the chest until he finally succumbed to his injuries. Or I could tell you about the McCarrans who murdered their autistic daughter at the age of 3. A pediatrician murdered her autistic daughter at the age of 3 by smothering her with a pillow upstairs in her bedroom. These are only a sampling of some of the stories that I could tell you. But yes, people do in fact hate disabled people, and the hate is so virulent and so strong that after every single one of these cases, without fail, the popular media narrative, whether it is liberal media or conservative media, whether it is policymakers or researchers or so-called advocates, will always tell the same story. Yes, this is sad. Yes, this is tragic, but the parents didn't have enough services. They didn't have enough support. They were burdened. They were stressed out. It is so challenging to take care of this kind of a person. So they understandably snapped, and you shouldn't judge them before you walk 10 miles in their shoes. And I'm sorry, excuse me, what the fuck is that supposed to mean? You are telling us that the person who deserves sympathy in these stories is the perpetrator rather than the person who they murdered, who was relying on them to care for and support them. You are saying that the disabled person's life, in other words, the disabled person's lives were the tragedy rather than the disabled person's murder. This is ableism. But more than hatred and revulsion of disabled people, ableism also teaches us to fear disability. Ableism teaches us that disability is to be feared, that we are to fear our bodies breaking down and changing, that we are to fear losing capacities, that we are to fear becoming disabled in ways that we haven't been before if we're already disabled, or to become disabled at all for those who were not disabled at all. Ableism teaches us to be afraid of disability, because in the popular imagination, disability relates to death, that disability is a sign of potential death because it is the loss of capacity, physical or mental. And the reality is we are all already dying. We start to die from the moment that we are born. Ableism also teaches us to be ashamed of disability. Ableism teaches us that disability is something shameful, that it is something to blame somebody for, and therefore the person who should always be blamed for disability will be the disabled person. Ableism teaches us that if we struggle to do something, or worse, find it impossible, then that is a source of moral failing, rather than a source of societal and political failing to provide the right support, to prioritize care, to prioritize human lives. The image that's on this screen here shows a poster of Mario Woods, who is a Black disabled man. It says, "Justice for Mario Woods" at the top. Over 50% of people killed by police are disabled. This is and perhaps an underestimate, and it's an older estimate. The text at the bottom says "Disability Justice Now" and "Black Disabled Lives Matter" with the hashtag in front of it. I left this here as an image in thinking about how disability and ableism specifically show up, and how disability and ableism show up in all of our conversations and in all of our work. You see, this is what is important to understand about ableism. The quote here from Mia Mingus starts by saying, "Ableism is connected to all of our struggles because it undergirds notions of whose bodies are considered valuable, desirable, and disposable." And that's what we have to understand, that when we talk about the issues that autistic people face in law, it is not just related to autism, nor even a disability as a whole, but it is an issue of ableism. And ending ableism requires us to address the other forms of oppression with which ableism is deeply interconnected. Ableism is codependent with, it is necessary for and dependent upon white supremacy, upon settler colonialism. Ableism is codependent with, it is necessary for and dependent on patriarchy and misogyny, on oppression of queer and trans people, on class oppression and capitalism. It is necessary and interconnected with all forms of violence and oppression. And that shows up in our lives because it is always disabled people at the margins of the margins who experience experience the brunt of oppression in all of its forms, whether that is through the rates of sexual violence, the rates of unemployment, underemployment, and precarious employment, rates of access to education, whether that is in K-12 or in higher educational spaces, whether that is in access to justice in the ways that our court systems and our legal profession operates. Ableism always impacts disabled people at the margins of the margins the most. And so the response to ableism requires us to listen to and learn from the leaders of self-advocacy, neurodiversity, mad pride, disability rights, and disability justice movements, because we are the ones whose lives are on the line. We are the ones who have the most to lose. We are the ones who are directly targeted by the effects of ableism, that is, ideas about us not even deserving life. And this is real, make no mistake. In COVID-19, when states and hospitals began publicizing their resource and healthcare rationing policies, people outside the disabled community either didn't know about it or didn't believe it. But we already knew that this was happening, because we've already known that autistic people and other disabled people are much more likely to be denied organ transplants, to be denied basic health care, to be denied the ability to live in our own homes and control our own services because of the assumption that we are not competent and the assumption that our lives are not worth living, and therefore the corollary that our lives are not worth saving. Michael Hickson, who is a Black man with disabilities in Texas, was literally left to die this summer when he sought treatment for COVID-19 because of assumptions that he would be better off dead, that his life was not one worth saving. Several years ago in Wisconsin, a doctor who has astoundingly won an award for bioethics deliberately transferred a 13-year-old boy with multiple intellectual and physical disabilities to his university hospital so that he could take the boy off of the antibiotics for pneumonia that he had been prescribed, pneumonia that he had recovered from successfully in the past, and instead, withholding all antibiotics, let the disease run its course, provide him only with some morphine, and refuse to even provide him with nutrition or hydration so that he could die, because according to this doctor, his life was not worth living. He was better off dead than disabled. Ableism is everywhere, and the struggle that we face is in fighting even to be believed in our own communities that in fact disabled people have knowledge worth knowing, that we have wisdom worth sharing, that we have lives worth living, that we deserve care and support, and we deserve care and support on our own terms, in connection with our cultures and our communities, in ways that respect and affirm our basic dignity and our autonomy and our competence, rather than presuming that we need to be taken care of, controlled, or managed, rather than assuming that it is in fact educators and social workers and doctors and family members who don't have disabilities that always know what's best for us, that they know what the solutions ought to be, rather than assuming that we exist only to be surveilled and controlled to make sure that we are not committing fraud, that we are not becoming unduly burdensome on social service systems, that we are not dragging down the rest of the classes that we are in, that we are not cheating on exams. Instead, we should focus on why and how our society needs to do better to prove that it is a society where all people can actually enjoy freedom, can actually enjoy access, can actually enjoy care and support and rights and justice. A core principle in the self-advocacy and neurodiversity movements is that we do nothing about us without us, which is actually what the shirt says that I'm wearing, nothing about us without us. And what that means is that when we have conversations about disability or indeed any other axis of marginality or oppression, that the people who are directly impacted need to be at center and leading those conversations. And that means a diversity of people. To be very, very clear and to be very explicit about that, it means that you bring in whole groups of autistic people in designing what an autism services program will look like. Because autistic people are the one that will be in that program. Because the people that you consult may be the people that will actually be enrolled in that program, that will be using that service, that will depend on that service. And so if you design that services program without involving autistic people at every stage of that process, it will not meet the needs of autistic people. it cannot meet the needs of autistic people because you won't know with any degree of certainty that what you are doing will be relevant to and useful for the needs of autistic people. When we talk about ending ableism, and ending ableism in ways that recognize how it is deeply connected to other forms of oppression and violence, we are also talking about uplifting the lives of disabled people, about affirming that we deserve to be present in society, to belong, to be part of the same world as everybody else. And you would think that that would be easy to achieve, but unfortunately it is not. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in now, it is the farthest possible from the world and the truth in which we live. I'm looking for the slide that I want. Where did it go? I'm going to leave this slide here. This one shows an image of Patricia Byrne, who is a multiracial disabled woman of color in a power chair, moving on a stage that has purple and blue lighting. And the text lists 10 principles of disability justice as Patricia Byrne has articulated them. And those principles include intersectionality, leadership of those who are most impacted, that it is anti-capitalist, emphasizes cross-community organizing, is about wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. What that means for me in staking out a vision of disability justice is a reflection and an opportunity for those of you who are here as legal and policy advocates to consider when we reach the limits of law and policy to enact change, which we often do, as we know. The earlier panel that talked about the limitations of the IDEA, the limitations of our current healthcare system, even with non-discrimination laws in place, the limitations of civil rights protections in the criminal legal context. When we reach the limits of law and policy to change and to challenge harmful and violent conditions, how do we then build a world that doesn't have to rely upon the mere minimums established by law to afford us the respect for human dignity that we deserve? How do we build a world in which all people, disabled or not, have meaningful access to care and support that we need? That no person is left homeless, that no person is left vulnerable to sexual violence, that no person is left deprived of the opportunity to work in the ways that work for us, and to avoid discrimination in their work, and to have their work be tied to and made contingent for access to housing or access to healthcare. How do we make sure, in other words, as my partner Shane Newmeyer will usually say, that nobody is left behind? How do we make sure that nobody is left behind? The law is not a very good tool for doing that, because the law leaves enormous gaps that can be impossible to fill within its existing structures. But for us as advocates and as humans, it is our prerogative to understand as far as the law can take us, especially in strategic advocacy, and then to go farther and beyond. It is our responsibility and our grave obligation to work in collaboration and community with the people who are directly affected by the laws and policies that we are working on. If that is in the context of direct client representation, then that is an exhortation for your client to be leading the entire relationship between you and that client. We talk about that using the buzzword client-centered representation, but I don't think a lot of people understand what that means in the context of mental disability, because we are so wrapped up in the idea of incompetence of disabled people that even attorneys who believe that they are in fact caring about clients' needs and desires will often still fall into the same paternalistic traps as other attorneys would do for clients who are not disabled but experience other legal issues stemming from marginalization. In the direct and impact litigation context is the question of, will this litigation lead to a precedent that is useful for the people on the ground? Will this lead to precedent that helps drive social change that activists are fighting for outside the courts and outside legal structures? If it is through policy work, are the policies that we are advocating for in line with the priorities of directly affected communities? Do these policies advance those priorities? Do these policies facilitate those priorities? And if not, if they are unrelated altogether from those priorities, or if they perhaps even inhibit progress toward those priorities, then we need to pause and move back and reassess. not just what policies we are advocating for, but the means by which we identified those policies and chose to work on them. So this is an opportunity for us to consider how our advocacy work can be responsive to and accountable to the people that we purport it to be for. Disability justice is a practice of valuing our body minds and of building a world that is more desirable for our future selves and for generations to come, requires this. It requires us to work beyond and past the law. And it invites us into a radical and brilliant imagination of what that future might be, of a future where ableism is history and where it is no longer radical for me to lead a conversation about the tenets of neurodiversity or the principles of disability justice, a future where we all can receive the care, rest, and love that we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. We have a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. So you can, anyone in the audience with a question, you can feel free to raise your virtual hand and we'll enable you to speak your question to Lydia.
This is Lydia. I saw a question earlier in the chat box where someone asked about the statistic of people who are unemployed. This came from a study within the last 4 years. I have it written down somewhere, and if you email me later, I will eventually email it back to you. I note eventually because I have ADD, and there's a really good chance that if you email me, I will either reply immediately or at 4 a.m. or next year.
Thank you for that. Okay, looks like we have a couple questions that have come up in the chat in the Q&A. I'll just read that aloud for everyone. The first one says, do you think some of the issues you've raised could be addressed by a reform in the Department of Education alongside policy and legal advocacy, or is it a lost cause?
So thank you, Alejandra, for asking that question. For me, when we talk about reform, it's a tricky conversation because we mean two different things. There are two kinds of reforms, broadly speaking, to be aware of. One type of reform is what Mariama Kaba outlines this difference very clearly. And Mariama Kaba is a leading thinker and writer and speaker on abolition. And to be very clear, I come here from an abolitionist perspective. I come from a perspective in that police and prisons do not make us safe and should not exist, that disability justice does not allow for existence of police or prisons. And likewise, in relation to that, our educational system as it exists is part of the same carceral systems that engender police and prisons in the first place, the same carceral systems that lead to institutionalization, short or long term, of disabled people, whether of psych-disabled people or of developmentally disabled people. So to that end, Mariama Kaba outlines two forms of reform: reformist reform and non-reformist reform. Non-reformist reform is the one that most people mean when they talk about reform. It is reforms that change the window dressing, that say, yes, we are still going to allow teachers to restrain and seclude you, but we'll make sure they're trained on how to properly restrain people first, and we'll remind them in a scolding voice that they are not supposed to restrain unless it is an extreme emergency and a last resort tactic. But of course, as we all know, anyone here who has worked in education, that does not stop teachers in districts that have adopted such policy reforms from restraining students wantonly, especially Black and brown disabled students. It does not stop them from injuring students. It does not stop them from killing students, and does not stop them from using restraint for any manner of things, including perceived defiance or non-compliance, let alone actual supposed violence. So non-reformist reform will get us nowhere. In fact, non-reformist reform can do more harm than good because it gives people the illusion of progress while therefore enabling and furthering additional and worsened harm. Sorry, that is reformist reform. It is a Friday afternoon and I am losing my ability to be coherent. Non-reformist reform, in contrast, are reforms that actually move us closer to justice and to abolition, where abolition is what is necessary. So a non-reformist reform is one that prohibits the use of restraint, that removes restraining devices from schools, and that strips funding away from schools and programs that have been using restraint that prevents funding from being used on tools meant for restraint, whether that is through chemical restraint or mechanical restraint or for seclusion rooms, and that in fact drives funding not only away from programs that use restraint or from purchase orders for restraint-related tools, but that puts that funding back in the hands of students and their families. So non-reformist reform, we should absolutely push for. But reformist reform does nothing and only exacerbates existing harm.
You've talked a lot about the intersection of different types of oppressions. How do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is or is not empowering autistic people?
Thank you, Kylie, for asking that question. I need to be very clear about my positionality here. I'm here as a non-Black person of color. I'm an East Asian person of color, and I'm an autistic person, and I do work in racial justice space. The Black Lives Matter movement was initially led by, and its leaders are, queer Black women. The Black Lives Matter movement, as a disparate, decentralized movement, which of course you will always have leadership in movements in some way or another, but it is decentralized, it is not hierarchical, has at times forced and furthered ableist ideas and visions, and at other times has centered perspectives and abolitionist work of disabled Black people, of disabled Black thinkers, of disabled Black leaders. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, which at its core is about fighting for Black people's ability to live and breathe in a country that has always reveled in and furthered Black people's deaths, and for the benefit and the furtherance of white supremacy, is about ensuring that all Black people can be valued in society, that no Black people have to face anti-Black oppression and white supremacy. And that means, and that includes, Black disabled people, and specifically Black autistic people. And there are many Black autistic people and other disabled leaders that speak and write very much on what Black Lives Matter means as Black disabled people. I would turn you to the work of Aza Atarefi, Talila Lewis, Dustin Gibson, Saray Jarrell Johnson. I would turn you to the work of Black disabled leaders, including many Black autistic leaders, which is most of the people that I've just named, who are speaking and writing about the necessity of movements organizing for Black people's lives in helping us become closer to disability justice.
The next question, if you feel comfortable answering, from an anonymous attendee says, how do you think being autistic makes you a better lawyer?
I would respond to that by saying that this is different for different autistic people, as you might imagine. I know of many other autistic lawyers too, and each of us have different strengths and different areas of struggle and things that we could improve upon. For me, how being autistic makes me a better lawyer is by sharpening my desire to be thorough and meticulous, as many of us are. And frankly, it helps to be able to focus on the same thing for 18 straight hours, although not helpful for the bladder, but very helpful for the work product. So there is a bit of a trade-off. But the other way in which this is very helpful for me, and particular to my life, is that being autistic has always given me a strong and visceral sense of justice. When I feel that something is wrong in any way, that something is unjust or harmful, I feel an overwhelming obligation to do something about it, whatever is in my resources to do, whatever it is in my lane to do, and whatever I might have capacity to do at a particular time. And not, to be very clear, that non-autistic people cannot similarly have a sense of justice. But I know that I'm not the only autistic person who's spoken of what this is like. To have a powerful demand, drive, and desire for justice, to do justice, to bring about justice. And that makes me a relentless advocate.
Thank you. We also have a hand raised in the audience. Katie Prince Valley, would you like to say your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. This presentation was incredible. I consider myself a progressive person, but you have opened my eyes to so many other layers of my own ableist thoughts and other things. So thank you for that. But my question is, do you think that the non-reformist reform you were talking about is even possible within the capitalist structure that we have here in the States? And if not, how do you envision it? But if so, how can we use, if it's possible, how can we use capitalism to as an advantage to getting to a better place?
I don't think capitalism will ever get us to a better place. At best, we can work within the system that we have for harm reduction. And that is both reducing our individual capacity to harm, because every person, including autistic people, and including autistic people that are multiply marginalized, we all have a capacity to harm. And it is our obligation to constantly take stock of what our capacity to harm might be and to work to reduce that harm. But more broadly, in the work that we do, it is an opportunity for us to think about how we can reduce the harm that our organizations could cause, that our policy advocacy could cause. How do we reduce that harm? So for example, within the capitalist system, it is worth it to fight for fair and living wages for people, because even though I want capitalism to be disappeared, it will not be disappeared by tomorrow morning. And by tomorrow morning, or actually by yesterday, if we're going to be very exact, people had to pay rent. And if you don't pay rent in the capitalist world we live in now, you can be evicted. And if you are evicted and you don't have anywhere to go and you don't have the resources for a security deposit, which you wouldn't if you couldn't make rent, you become homeless. That is a real and immediate harm. And so if we can work for non-reformist reform that acknowledges the existing system but lessens those harms, then it is of course worth doing and worth working for. However, there's a recognition that that still is not the same thing as ending that whole system in the first place, that the underlying system is still profoundly harmful. So a non-reformist reform that prevents eviction, that allows people who've occupied unoccupied land for long enough to become the legal owners of title to that land, those are things that we should fight for, that we should support. We should applaud the parents in Philadelphia who were a group of homeless parents that occupied unoccupied homes and just won their battle in court to be given title to the real property. And that's great. And we should fight for that to be institutionalized within the system as it exists. But in the end, we still need to keep our eye on the prize and keep in mind that the vision we're fighting for is a world in which nobody ever has to worry about becoming homeless, or in which money is the deciding factor in who gets to live somewhere that is nice and who gets to live somewhere that is infested with roaches and bed bugs and who else knows what. And so that is to say, non-reformist reform does not in any way meaningfully get rid of capitalism, but it undermines some of its most violent aims while we are still working to abolish it.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question from the audience from Elizabeth Sheridan. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Hi, Lydia. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. I think I was just wishing all my colleagues that are in the mental health space could hear this today, and I'd love to hear your perspective on how clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, anyone in the country working at autism centers in particular might better serve our families and folks with autism that come to seek support from us in the context of all of the facets of ableism that you just reviewed, which is an unfair question to ask when you have 2 minutes to go, but thank you.
The short version is, and I do a lot of trainings for DSPs and for clinicians. I do a lot of trainings and workshops, and they're usually 8 hours long. So that just gives you a sense of how much information there is to share about this. But the shortest answer that I can give you is that therapies and services only work if they're designed by and with the priorities of the person receiving them in mind. And with that person having ultimate control at all times in determining and in adapting what the goals of that therapy need to be. Now, I can already hear people thinking, okay, but Lydia, what about people that are small children? What about people that are non-speaking? What about people who have a communication disability and can't articulate what they want and what they need? And my response to that is always, everybody has the ability to communicate. The question is, do you have the ability to understand?
Thank you very much for being here to give your presentation and answer those questions. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's symposium on autism and the law. For me, the purpose of attending symposia and conferences like these is first and foremost to learn, right? And be a part of and a witness to thoughtful and provocative dialogue. I certainly believe that that aim has been accomplished today, and I hope you all do as well. Let us all take what we learned today back into our lives, whether academic, professional, personal, and continue these conversations about autism and disability with those people in our lives who weren't here today with us at this symposium. Thank you once again to each of our panelists and speakers and our moderators for being here with us. Thank you to Professor Emily Zimmerman and to our partners at the Autism Institute for helping to initially bring this symposium to life, and to my colleagues on the Law Review and our faculty advisor, Professor Deborah Gordon, for all of your help leading up to this day. Thank you finally to our executive symposium editor, Evan Polgreen, for putting on this fantastic program, and for all of your blood, sweat, and tears that went into this day. So that concludes today's symposium, and I hope you all keep the Drexel Law Review on your radars and look out for our symposium issue that will be published in the spring, which will publish articles written by several of the speakers you heard from today, covering what was discussed in more detail. So thank you again. Have a good evening. Stay safe.